Hello, everyone, and welcome to my live. I am Mark Turi, and welcome again to my channel, as always. If you are here live, or if you are watching this on the replay, please like my video and please subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to get my channel to grow and so it could reach more people, so I could do more interviews in the future with other people in our space. And I hope you enjoy my content. Again, I'm sort of someone who likes to talk about a whole myriad of different topics and issues and things, academics, including history and philosophy, religion, and so forth. And so I hope that if you're joining us for the first time, again, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel and go back to older videos and see if you'd like, make some comments, and let me know how you like them. Wanted to say hello to my good friend here, Joe Giuseppe. Hello, Joe. It's always good to see you here. Joe is one of our chosen members who will ascend to a throne when I decide. When I decide, okay, we're allowed to go there. And Irish Mart is here. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to see you two, to Joe and Irish. Thank you. It says here, Joe, is that the synagogue in Bucharest on the thumbnail? It looks like the one I saw there. I have absolutely no idea. I went to that website that you gave me to give copyright-free thumbnails, and I just typed in synagogue, and it was the first one that came up. And I was like, oh, this looks nice. Um, and it's a Moorish style synagogue, which is the same as the Dohanutza synagogue here in Hungary and the Moorish revival, which of course was an architecture school. That architecture school of history from like the 19th century, mostly in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to make specifically for synagogues more Eastern. So it had a lot of Moorish, obviously that meaning Muslim, Hispanic, Turkish kind of Ottoman influence, and it was a very. I actually love the Moorish revival synagogues, and lots of Moorish revival synagogues are here in Budapest. So if it's in Bucharest, maybe I wouldn't be surprised that they were probably, you know, I don't know that kind of style of synagogue spread to different parts. But please forgive me, I have absolutely no idea whether or not that is that particular synagogue. So no idea there. Let me just see here. Uh, was it this one? Let me just open my browser. What is it called? It is called Thumbnail AI. Thumbnail AI is the one that you showed me. Um, Pexelis? I don't think so. No, Thumbnail AI. But there's other ones out there. I'm going to try and experiment with some other ones as well. I do find it to be fine. I've had almost all my thumbnails come from them, except if I choose a thumbnail that's, a screenshot. But yeah, so far that could be Bucharest. Maybe it is. I have no clue. Again, wouldn't surprise me if it was. But I just typed in synagogue. Any thoughts on the Pete Diddy accusations? I have not been following up on that at all. I just know that he claimed that he got how many hundreds of bottles of baby oil from Costco, and then Costco literally released a statement to say that they do not carry baby oil at all. So Diddy was trying to be like, "Well, I just bought it at Costco, no big deal." And Costco's like, "No, you didn't." So when that happens, I hear that sad trumpet. But I actually have no idea what's going on with P. Diddy. I'm not sure. Maybe you can all enlighten me, but I have no idea. All I know is that thankfully the Danube River is not as bad flood-wise as it used to be, and that's all. I have no clue what's going on. I watched a documentary today called "The Accidental President" on HBO. It's about a young woman. Please forgive me. because the name of this young woman is very, very long, but her name is, I think, Svet, Svetlana Tsi- Skubaya, something like this. Please, I butchered that, I'm sure. Who became the leader of of an opposition and actually won an election in Belarus a few years ago. And it's all about her having to leave and go to go to Lithuania. Anyway, that's what I did today. So I've got a slideshow that I'll probably do in the next coming weeks on Russian minorities in the former Soviet Union, the states of the former Soviet Union, like independent ones. But I haven't a clue. I'm just blissfully unaware of these things. I also finished binging all 10 seasons of Friends, which I watched when I was a kid quite a bit, and then got in and out of it as time went on. And I have to say those last 3 seasons were not so good. There's a lot of crap in those last 3 seasons. But then again, um, I still like the show overall, and it ended very well. But there was just a lot of like, What are you doing?" You know? So that's it. I mean, literally, that's it. Um, not too much for me on my end. As I said, just updating everybody on the flood, which again is kind of getting taken care of. As far as like news in the United States and things like this, I don't really know what's been going on too much. Of course, it's the election cycle, so everyone's geared up for that. And you know, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world, unfortunately, in the Middle East, unfortunately, which I'll be honest when I preface to say, like, we are going to do, my PowerPoint today is going to be on like Jewish ethnic divisions and religious movements, but I just don't want to touch that issue because no matter where you are, someone's going to say that you're in the wrong and blow up with your arguments and straw man. And I've had enough of that stuff already in the past year. I'd rather just try to educate people on like who are we actually, who are we as a Jewish people and filter through some of the stuff that like, bringing multiple perspectives. And everyone can have their own political beliefs here. Whether you support something or don't support something, you're still my friend. It doesn't matter. I have my thoughts, you have your thoughts. But at the end of the day, there's actually do have a personal connection to over there and you know, obviously very worried for the people that I love, but also for people who I don't even know. And that's it. So I just try to stay out of those kinds of issues, you know. Um, and yes, so no one told me life was going to be this way. Clap, 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 clap. You got into a cult, which moved books and ashtrays. And my life was never the same. It was definitely not my week, my day, my month, or even my 3 years. Yeah. Good show, though, Friends. Good show. My favorite character personally is Phoebe. I think she's hysterical. Her and Joey, I don't know why, just her and Joey are great. The best actor, in my opinion, on the show was David Schwimmer playing Ross, just his acting alone. Of course, Chandler's hysterical. I love Monica, Rachel, a little whiny, but she grows up. But for me, Phoebe and it's just so brilliant. I just to play someone that ditzy, you've got to be a genius. And like Lisa Kudrow is actually very, very smart in real life. So anywho, and Danny DeVito is probably my favorite guest character as the stripper towards the end of the season 10. But like Charlie Sheen was in an episode early on. Um, man, anyway, lots of stuff. Showing my age here, but one of my school teachers got up and got us to sing the theme song at the end of one term. Well, that was a good teacher. And 30 years, I think it was 30 years this month, if I'm not mistaken, was when French premiered in September '94. Maybe just like I think the 30th anniversary was just like maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. Um, but yeah, anyway, 10 years, 10 years, lots of episodes. It took me quite a while to get through, but I'm glad I did. Still haven't finished Star Trek Voyager or Enterprise because I don't want to. But there we go. I finished Friends because I wanted to. um, but yeah, let's just leverage into the topic today. Um, okay, so the first thing is not serious because I already made my serious preface. I know that I keep plugging this. I guess you guys are going to probably have a drinking game of how many times I plug this video. But on my channel, there is a video called Overview of Religious Studies. And one of the slides that in that presentation that I did to the Nerdy Bunch last year, was the difference between a universalizing religion and an ethnic religion. And I just want to give you the very basics before we actually get into the actual PowerPoint. So religions like Christianity and Islam are, two of the biggest religions in the world. Roughly 55% of the world's population belong to those two religions. Roughly 30% Christians of the whole world, and roughly 25% are Muslim. And they are called universalizing because they have their idea of a gospel or a set of beliefs in something, and they actively go after converts with proselytization. Of course, not all churches and not all Muslim organizations do proselytize, but the overwhelming amount do, such as the Catholic Church, most Protestant churches, and of course in Sunni Islam. So in that case, their beliefs, their faith is first, and they try to convert people regardless of things like ethnicity, which is a shared history, shared language, culture, etc. But in contrast to that are ethnic religions. Judaism is one, Hinduism is another one, Zoroastrianism, and many, many others, Shintoism, for example. And while some ethnic religions or ethno religions like Judaism have a way to convert, there are some that you just cannot convert to, like the Druze or the Zoroastrians or so forth. And usually it means you have to be born into it, and the people in the religion, because they tend to be smaller in size, the exception there being with Hinduism, but they're connected by an ethnicity because they have a shared history, culture, and so forth. So, putting that out there, I have to start to say, of course, that the Jewish people and Judaism, which we know it today, is the descendant, okay, of a group of peoples who began their life usually around the North Africa. They were called the Phoenicians. And then the Phoenician people spread to many different areas of what would today be North Africa, the Middle East, even Southern Europe, and so forth, and became groups like the Carthaginians and the ancient Egyptians, one of which became the Canaanites. And if you, I would say, if you study the Bible in any way, you probably know that word Canaanites, right? Because I guess they were talked about quite a bit. And so the best archaeological anthropological evidence suggests that the Hebrew people were the descendant of one of the many groups of Canaanite peoples. We spoke a Semitic language, which, like Phoenician and the Semitic languages and languages of what's called the ancient Levant or the Levantian peoples, which of course is the Eastern Mediterranean and today Middle East, or the eastern part of the Middle East, or western part, pardon me, of the Middle East, and then grew into these different, speaking these different what are called Afro-Asiatic languages: Berber, Carthaginian, ancient Egyptian, Hausa, Somali, Arabic, and Hebrew. And then eventually we were established. Now, I'm not an ancient historian by any means, but this is just stuff that I've learned along the way. Joe says, is there a third group of religions which don't proselytize or are ethnic? Yes and no. So, for example, in the Christian tradition, there is the Eastern Orthodox religion, which used to, when it was the Byzantine Orthodox Church, they used to proselytize. And in fact, the two saints that developed the Cyrillic alphabet, Saint Cyril and Methodius, who were brothers, they tried to convert the Khazars and they tried to convert other Turkic groups in Central Asia, and then they also tried to convert the Moravians. But today, Eastern Orthodox, like if you're born Greek, you're probably Greek Orthodox. If you're born Russian, you're probably Russian Orthodox, especially if you're ethnically Greek or ethnically Russian. Same with Romania, same with Bulgaria, same with Serbia. So Christianity is technically, because of Catholics and Protestants, are mostly considered to be universalizing religions. However, there's this one exception that's called hybrid. And so it is Christianity, Orthodox Christianity is Christianity, but they don't really proselytize anymore because most of the time when you're inside of a church, you're already linked to an ethnicity. Also, Armenians belong to the Apostolic Church, which I think is Orthodox or Oriental Orthodox. And some people even consider the Irish Catholics to be an ethnic religion. So there are these little exceptions, but this is sort of a general speaking that Christianity as a whole, the more number of actual churches and organizations do proselytize, so that's why it's called a universalizing religion. And then, as I mentioned before, they have an exception with Judaism because Judaism does accept converts. You have to go to a rabbi, and tradition says you must go to the rabbi 3 times because the first 2 times the rabbi will try to dissuade you from joining. And then on the third time, he'll bring you to the court. And then you go through a conversion process, which in some cases takes a year or 2 years or more than that. And as someone who converts to Judaism, you have to be more observantly religious than people who were born into it. So if you're born into it, you're kind of lucky because you don't necessarily have to be very observant. But if you convert, the expectations are higher. So that's just again what we refer to as an ethnic religion. And Zoroastrianism, if your mother is Zoroastrian, you're Zoroastrian, and if not, there's no way to convert. It's the same with the Druze faith, the Ismaili faith, and many other smaller faiths, in Middle Eastern religions. So everyone kind of does their own thing. But that being said, and that getting started, my presentation is going to take us, as I said, the very basics. I just mentioned, very brief history of the Hebrew peoples coming from the Canaanites, coming from the Phoenicians, getting into what's called the ancient Levant. And the Levant today is mainly what would be the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, Israel, Palestine, and then parts of Lebanon and Western Syria, kind of around, and parts of Jordan, which would be, the area between, I guess, the Mediterranean Sea and then a little bit further east, not in the Arabian Peninsula. That's obviously Arabia, and then Egypt proper. So Egypt that is from the west of the Suez Canal, that was considered, of course, North Africa. And then if you go closer to Iraq and Iran, you're getting into the eastern part of the Middle East and so forth. And then by the time you go to Afghanistan, you're already in Central Asia. So anyway, that's just the basic stuff. But the first thing I want to talk about, or at least the first two eras I want to talk about first. So the first is I'm going to start here with the Jewish movements during the Second Temple era, but I do have to mention just briefly the First Temple era. And so the first Jewish temple era, which was when we had our first temple, which was, built in Jerusalem. And that temple era is from 1200 BCE until 585 BCE, when it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. Just one second. And yes, Joe, we will be talking about them a little bit. Of course, I also do as well. Very much, yes. And then we have the rebuilding of the temple at 515 until, of course, around 70 CE, when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. What we're going to focus on today is that what we call Jewish movements is what in Christianity you would call a denomination. So in Judaism, movement is probably the best definition to explain these different groups within, Judaism, whereas in Christianity, it's denomination, but if you can only think of a denomination, that's fine too. It really at that is just kind of grasping straws at that point, little semantics, but there is a little bit of a difference. So we have a bunch of movements in modern Judaism, which I am going to get into towards the end of this presentation. But right now, we're sort of in the Second Temple era, and there are actually four movements, and they're all very distinct movements that the Jewish people were affiliated with and linked to, including, class. They had different class structures, they had different theologies, they had different political opinions, and so on. And so the top four, and maybe anyone have heard of these before, I'd love to know, because I didn't grow up terribly religious, so a lot of this stuff for me is fairly new, to be honest with you. But these groups were called the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots. Now, I do want to say that there's historically a fifth group that are called the early Christians, because you can see the time here, 70 CE, right? If you're a Christian, then the idea is that Jesus was born in the year 0 CE and lived to 33 CE or something like this. Again, I don't know how literal every church takes that or every interpretation, but that's at least, the idea. And that group were called either early Christians or they were called the Nazarenes. Now, the reason why I'm not going to list it here is just because the early Christians and the Nazarenes then go, of course, all the way, very radically all the way to become a different religion. When in Christianity, you call him the Apostle Paul, spreads Christianity, you know, over he goes to Damascus and so forth and whatever. And then, of course, eventually the first pope, who you guys call Saint Peter, or Catholics call Saint Peter, I should say, becomes the pope, and then there's an institution, and so that takes us way, 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 in a different turn to early Christian history. And I just want to focus on early Jewish history, but of course, I will acknowledge that the Nazarenes and the early Christians were also part of this movement. So again, these are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. And we're going to go through each of these four groups. So the first one is, who are the Pharisees? So the Pharisees, as far as class was concerned, they were known to be the class of the layman, meaning, of course, that Jewish people in this time, and when we had the temple in both eras, we actually had priests. Now, we don't have priests anymore. We have rabbis, and I'm going to get into why that is again also in this presentation. But this was the class that weren't the priests. They were basically the commoners. They were the people that would go into the temple and observe the rituals and so forth. But another interesting part about the Pharisees is that they were the scribes, and this is because the Pharisees accepted both what was called the oral Torah and the written Torah. So, like most traditions, we had a set of oral laws and oral teachings that had been passed down, but had never really been written before. And so, during this temple era, especially the later part of the Second Temple era, the Pharisees were the scribes that wrote down the laws and the stories to become the written Torah, and this group accepted both of them. They had some interesting social and political ideas, especially when it came to law. First thing is they believed in the evolution of Jewish law. And second is they believed that human beings should use reason in order to interpret Jewish law. Another strong characterization is that the Pharisees resisted what is referred to as Hellenization. And Hellenization is the adoption of Greek culture, language, art, political structures, etc. So think of wanting to become more Greek. That could be both voluntary or involuntary, but the Pharisees rejected this. So they did not like the fact that there had been Greek cultural, linguistic, and even other influences in Judaism. Okay, so at the time, of course, there were lots of Greeks and Greek speakers around. Alexander was, kind of around. I'm not sure about this period exactly, but of course, he was a Greek that did spread into the Middle East. And then they had the what are they called? Oh, what were those gentlemen called now? The Philistines, who I think, if I'm not mistaken, were also Greek speakers. So there were Greek speakers in the Levant at the time, and they, of course, being from Europe, had a very, I guess, sort of, what would the word be? They had a very good and very popular culture. Now, the next thing is that the Pharisees would then become, and their ideas would become the foundation of rabbinical Judaism, which I'm going to get into also in a moment. I will answer this question in a couple of slides. The answer is yes. To some extent, yes. I appreciate it, Joe. But yes, absolutely. Okay. The next group were the Sadducees. And the Sadducees, now these are, as far as class is concerned, these are the opposite. These are more of the upper class people, because the Sadducees were the class of the high priests, of the Jewish aristocracy at the time, and of merchants. So generally people that were fairly well to do and had power religiously, structurally, culturally. Now, the Sadducees had a different idea of the Torah to the Pharisees, because they only really favored the written Torah and they rejected the oral Torah. They were also in charge of maintaining the second temple. And as someone, I've been to Israel and I've been to Jerusalem. Jerusalem's actually one of my favorite cities in the world. When I went there a number of years ago now, I guess it was 16 years ago, ironically, maybe 6 months after I left Scientology, there's a video presentation that the people showed us, because, of course, the Second Temple remnants are still there. The Western Wall, which is called the Kotel, which is where Jews will pray. If you ever see a picture, you can Google the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. That's the wall of the temple, and behind there, and around that area, there are ruins. And the people who are working at this, I don't know if I would call it a museum or just a archaeological site, showed a video, a 3D rendered video of what it was like for a Jewish person to go into the temple and to receive certain rituals and rites. And it like fascinated the heck out of me, because, of course, we don't have this anymore. And not since this era have we had a temple. There's been no temple since it was destroyed. So, these were the individuals that were entrusted to maintain the temple. Another strict characterization was that the Sadducees, because they were embracers of popular culture and so forth, they believed very strongly in Hellenization. They wanted to adopt more Greek class culture and so forth, because it was so popular at the time and they were enamored by it. So things like Greek language, Greek fashion, Greek art, Greek tradition, Greek political structures were all, seen to be a very good thing by the Sadducees. And finally, they were the founders of Hellenic Judaism, which did not survive the Second Temple era. The next one is my personal favorite, because these individuals are so different from when I think of modern Judaism, and they're called the Essenes. So here are some qualities or some characteristics of the Essenes. Well, first of all, they had a very strict hierarchical structure to their sect. They were also considered to be very, very conservative in how they lived. They were ascetics, and an ascetic, or someone with an asceticist lifestyle, is someone who denies themselves earthly pleasures, lives very simply, and kind of, doesn't have any it doesn't have much money, doesn't have much decadence, etc. So they're very simply living and so forth. and then they were celibate. So I don't know if there is any connection between the beliefs of the Essenes and, let's say, Catholic monks, for example, or other kind of monks, because I don't think the Essenes were monks, but they were kind of close to it, which again fascinates me. But they had some characteristics that were overlapped and were kind of close. Another one is, again, if you are Christian, you know the idea of a baptism. It's very symbolic. I understand that there are some churches like the Baptists who say you don't have to be baptized. If you want, you can do it as an adult. But Catholics and most Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, and even in the Latter day Saints faith, they baptize, I think, when they're like 8 or 12 or whatever it is. So it's a very, very big symbol. And the Essenes did daily baptisms, which I think is really interesting, again, especially as someone who's Jewish. The last thing is that they were considered mystics. And if anyone has ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, these were a group of documents, actual scrolls, so written on, I guess, papyrus, that was found in the West Bank in the 1940s, and they have been translated. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, were the library, okay, of the Essenes sect. So we had some historical documents that described who these people were, like the Essenes, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. But really, this was an entire library. And in fact, if you go onto Amazon or Barnes and Noble, Chapters Indigo, Cole's Books, wherever you live, the famous online bookstore, and you type in Dead Sea Scrolls, you can find a translated copy of it. I have not personally read it, so I'm not as familiar with what the actual context is, but just understanding that it is the Essenes library, that somebody, you know, hid in a cave, probably during the Second Temple era when the Romans were clamping down on these groups, and then it was discovered all those years later. So just completely fascinating story. I want to say hello to Chad. How are you, Clearwater Chad? Thank you so much for being here. And yes, Joe, I apologize if I dismiss this because it's coming up next, and we are going to talk about this. But hello, Clearwater Chad. Thank you so much. So, as Joe says, is this where the word zealot comes from? Because this is our fourth sect. So, who were the zealots? Okay, most of us probably speak English as our first language, but even if we don't, if you have a dictionary handy, you can look up the word zealot in the English dictionary, and it usually has to do something, something to do with like being very enthusiastic. If someone is a religious zealot, they always really just want to share their beliefs with you in a very enthusiastic way. The zealots of the Jewish times sort of have a lot of that overlap, okay? The first was that they were very politically radical. So that can be something. Being radical can also be a zealot. Call someone a zealot. They're not only very enthusiastic, but they can be very radical in their beliefs. They also had a strong sense of Jewish nationalism because at the time of the Second Temple era, the Romans were becoming more influential. And the Romans were, again, the ones that destroyed the Second Temple. So the Zealots were focused on the expulsion of the Romans from what was previously called the kingdoms of Judea and Israel. The Zealots often believed in violence against the Romans and taking up arms to defeat the Romans because it was an occupation. And so they would go after the Roman soldiers. So just a couple years after 70 AD, so just around the time and after the time the Romans destroyed the temple, the Zealots were still around, and they were, taking up arms against the Romans. And one of the most radically devout groups was called the Sicarii. And if anyone has ever heard of the siege of Masada, the siege of Masada, Masada is um, a hilltop fortress. It's like I've been there. It's like something out of J.R.R. Tolkien or The Lord of the Rings. It's literally a fortress castle on top of a mountain. and you can go up there. I've been there. It was really tough to walk up and down there. And then I realized there was a cable car, which I should have taken. But it was amazing, this amazing old, beautiful, beautiful fortress where about 960 zealots in the Sakari faction escaped to, and the Romans ended up destroying them. And I have a feeling, and I forgot to fact check this, but I do believe that some of them did commit suicide rather than be taken captive by the Romans. I think some of these zealots did end up taking their own lives. If I'm mistaken about that, forgive me. I could have that mixed up with another story. But regardless, they were like the last group of people that were trying to fight off the Romans. So by this year, 74 CE, not only is the Second Temple gone, but the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, which of course bury their library literally in a cave, and then the Zealots, where Masada is, if you look at the Dead Sea, it's in the southwestern part of the Dead Sea. And so they are pretty much destroyed, and Judaism, changes from that point on. In 135 Common Era, the Romans will rename what was previously called Judea and Israel. They would call it Palestine, and Palestine means land of the Philistines. It's a Latin word of a Greek word translation. And again, the Philistines were most likely a Greek-speaking seafaring maritime peoples who lived in what today would be the Gaza Strip. And Gaza City was actually founded way, way, way back when by Alexander the Great. So they had very much a Greek connection, and they did that to cut off the Jewish people from what was then previously Israel and Judea. So that happens. So now I want to talk to you about what is rabbinical Judaism, because rabbinical Judaism is going to be the foundation of our current movements that, again, I'm going to get into at the ending part. The last, I think, 6 or 7 slides of this presentation are going to be on what are these different denominations or movements, and they're all based on rabbinical Judaism. So, what is rabbinical Judaism? I mentioned before that rabbinical Judaism has its roots in the Pharisees movement, but it starts around 500 years after the Second Temple era. So the rabbinical movement begins in the 6th century CE. One of its founding ideas is that Moses received both the oral and the written Torah at Mount Sinai. We can see that that is a through line with the Pharisees' idea, because the Pharisees believed in both the written and oral Torah, as opposed to the Sadducees, who only accepted the written Torah. Before the second, I should say, before the rabbinical Jewish era, before I should say rabbinical Judaism took part, it was actually forbidden to write down the oral Torah. But after the destruction of the Second Temple, there had to be preservations. And this is where the Pharisees and their scribes came in, because a lot of Jewish traditions and prayers and so forth kind of went into exile because there was no one sort of central place where Jewish people could gather. And this is where we get terms like rabbi and synagogue, which I also believe, if I'm not mistaken, have Greek etymologies. Also ironic that the Pharisees were against Greek language, but a rabbi is a teacher, and a synagogue is, of course, our place of worship, but it's sort of like a meeting place. And so instead of having one temple, the rabbis who were the teachers, who were not priests, they couldn't be priests because there were no temple, set up synagogues because, again, there was no temple. And many of these synagogues began to form, including in places like Babylon. And if you know anything about the history of Babylon, you'll know that Babylon is in Iraq. And again, if I'm not mistaken, I think the actual city is today Baghdad. Someone can fact check that on me. And this leans in forward to a very, very important scripture, one that is often missed because it's very, very Jewish and it's not really well known outside of Jewish circles. And it's called the Talmud. So rabbinical Judaism codifies what is called the Babylonian Talmud. Before I get to that, to what that is, I just want to tell you here that what is the Talmud? So the Talmud is the core text of rabbinical Judaism. As I mentioned, it was codified. Um, it was codified, pardon me, during this era. It is a multi-volume book. You can purchase it from Jewish and Judaica shops. There can be as many as 28 volumes, so it's very much kind of like a large encyclopedia. And inside of this are many primary sources and commentaries and lecture notes. And it's very famously known in the Jewish circles for having very many different contradictory opinions on Jewish laws and theologies because it depends on the rabbi. And so, one topic of Jewish law, like kosher or a biblical story or something, will end up having three different opinions. And this is kind of where a joke comes in about Judaism, which is that if you take three rabbis and you put them in a room and you give them one topic to discuss, they'll come out with four opinions. And that's because that's really what the Talmud is. It's a lot of contradiction. Now, as I mentioned before, there is such a thing called the Babylonian Talmud, which was codified in Babylon. There's also the Jerusalem Talmud, but that usually is the lesser one, I guess, if that's a word to say, lesser. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's not as many volumes. Certainly, the bulk of it is from Babylon, from the Babylonian Talmud. And then again, I'm sure many people who are here probably have heard the word yeshiva before. It's a very common word. A yeshiva is like a seminary, except instead of graduating and becoming a rabbi, which would be what you do at theological school or rabbinical school, if an individual goes to a yeshiva, they study the Talmud, and it can take many, many years. So it's like a school to study the Talmud, which is a yeshiva. And of course, if you know anything about films, there's a wonderful movie with Barbara Streisand called Yentl, which is about a young woman played by Barbara Streisand who wants to study the Talmud in the yeshiva, but she can't because only men can study the Talmud. Of course, I will say that is more true for the Orthodox community, but there are many liberal communities where men and women can and do study the Talmud. So after this, what happens is we get this transition, okay, from rabbinical Judaism. And Judaism at this point is mainly practiced in the Middle East. Of course, it does spread to other areas, but it's mainly practiced. And, in the 7th century, Islam is founded. And shortly after that, because of the fact that Islam had conquered and taken over Jerusalem and parts of the Middle East that were sacred to both Jews and Christians, there was also the Crusades. And so it really wasn't until later, until the Middle Ages, when we start to see at least two of these three ethnic communities and ethnic groups start to form. The very, very first ethnic community, ethnic division in in the Jewish world is the one that I think most people are going to know about. It's also the largest. Okay. And this is the Ashkenazi Jewish community. Again, without even knowing it, I'm pretty sure when I go through some of these characteristics, it'll become a little bit more apparent for reasons that I also will explain. So, who are the Ashkenazi Jews? The first thing to note is that the word Ashkenazi comes from the word for Germany in the Hebrew language. So German or Germany in Hebrew. So during the times when the Islamic Empire and the Crusaders were, going into Jerusalem and so forth, a lot of Jewish people left. And this particular group ended up from the Middle East into the Holy Roman Empire. For those who know anything about the Holy Roman Empire, it was a very large empire that wa- essentially is a part of modern Germany, parts of Denmark, Switzerland, Austria, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, northern France, and then even parts of northern Italy, parts of Slovenia, and even parts of today Poland and the Czech Republic. It has its height in the 14th century, and it's defeated in the 19th century with different reasons, but also Napoleon is a big part of that. But regardless, a number of Jewish people would flee and they would make homes in this Holy Roman Empire around the 9th century. Almost immediately, within a couple hundred years, there were mass expulsions throughout Europe from the 12th to the 16th century, where in Germany, in France, in Silesia, Austria, Hungary, Poland, in Italy, and so forth, were expelling Jews. Jews were also not considered citizens in many of these countries until at least the 17th, 18th, if not 19th centuries. And so this forced many Jewish communities to go east. At one time, in what would be from around the 12th to the 16th century, and even from the 16th to the 19th century, Poland, which was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Hungary specifically, were safe havens. But of course, there was still anti-Semitism, especially in the 19th to 20th century. So by the late 19th century and the early 20th century, many Jewish people had been expelled to the Russian Empire, which at the time consisted of the Baltic states, Russia, Eastern Poland, Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine. However, starting in the 1880s, there were a number of what are called pogroms. There were, I think, hundreds of them. And if you take a major city in the Russian Empire, Riga, Moscow, Odessa, Chisinau, Krakow, Warsaw, Minsk, Kiev, Kharkiv, etc., where there was a substantial Jewish population, there were these pogroms. And a pogrom is either considered to be a random or premeditated act of mob violence against a local Jewish, uh, uh, you know, uh, whatever you want to call it, local Jewish community, or in some cases, against their property and their stores and their shops and their synagogues. And so it then many Jewish people left and fled for other countries in the English speaking world. So some went to England, but a lot went to the US and Canada. They also went to South Africa, South America, and of course, Australia and New Zealand. And today, around 10 to 11 million people of the 16 million people Jewish population are considered to be Ashkenazi. And this is why when we think of Jewish people sometimes, and when we think especially we think of Ashkenazi Jewish culture, we may think of things like bagels and cream cheese, pickles, the delicatessen, blintzes, knishes, kugel. All of this is not the entire Jewish culture, but it is the Ashkenazi Jewish culture because in places like New York City, the Carnegie Deli, Katz's Deli would sell these, meats and koshered meats and whatever. And this kind of has become the staple, I would say, of what it means to be Jewish. And that's why I think you know, in certain eras we think of all Jews as being Ashkenazi, which of course would mean that we all have a European heritage, or at least that we had spent a lot of time in Europe, but that's not always the case. I just want to say hello to Black Boots. Good afternoon. I see I missed it. Yep, no problem. Go back and watch. It's going to be a little bit longer of an episode, I think, but I'm, because I think it's really interesting. But thank you, Black Boots. Thank you for being here. So again, these are the Ashkenazi Jewish community, but there are two more communities. The first one is very, very close and dear to my heart because I know that a lot of people, when they look at me, they tend to see me as being more European and especially more Eastern European. I also live in Hungary, which has always been a predominantly Ashkenazi Jewish country, especially in, I would say at least from the 17th century onwards. However, I am of my Jewish heritage, only a quarter of my Jewish heritage is Ashkenazi. Three-quarters of my Jewish heritage is actually part of this community. And so I have people my whole life who have told me I don't look Jewish, which again is stupid, and I'll explain why in a moment. But I often get told I don't look Jewish, mostly by people who aren't Jewish. But I have been told that I look very Ashkenazi by some people who tend to be Ashkenazi. And yet I've been told by Sephardic Jewish people, especially in Israel, that I really look Sephardic. So I don't know who to believe. Um, because three-quarters of my heritage comes from this community. Um, so who are the Sephardic Jews? Well, just like the term Ashkenazi, the word Sephardic stems from the Hebrew word for Spain. And just like the Ashkenazi Jews, during the Muslim conquests of the Middle East and then the Crusaders and their reactions, a lot of Jewish people fled to Europe, as I mentioned, and they specifically fled this group to Iberia, which of course is Spain and Portugal. They lived again from around the ninth century ish, maybe give or take at this time, maybe give or take a century, but basically around that time. And for most of the time, they were pretty peaceful, living in Spain, what is today Spain and Portugal. But if we know our history, and I'm sure many of us do, in 1492, the King and Queen of Spain decided to make a reconquest of Spain to not only drive out the Kingdom of Granada, which was a leftover of the Muslim Moorish kingdom that had still been in southern Spain. Of course, the Moors had entered Spain, I think, around the 8th century. And this Andalusia was really the last stronghold. But also part of that proclamation of the Reconquista was that, or Reconquista, was that uh, anyone who is Jewish, okay, or Muslim, either had to convert to Catholicism or they had to flee, they had to leave. And in 1497, there was a similar reconquest and decree in Portugal. So where did the people who didn't want to convert, where did they go? Well, depending on where they lived in Spain and what ports they could get access to, many of these Jews went to North Africa. So that would be today's countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. In Egypt, we're going to put a little asterisk because, of course, in Alexandria, there had already been a Jewish community beforehand, and they are connected to the third group that I'm going to speak about afterwards or after this slide. But those were, quite popular for many people. Now, the Balkans and Anatolia, okay. So in the Balkans, we had Jews that went to what today would be Greece, Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Crimea. They went to Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia. They went to Albania, and so on. And also like Anatolia, which they went to Izmir, today called Izmir, and Istanbul. They would be part of the Ottoman Empire. In addition to that, there was a group that went to Aleppo and Syria. Well, that was also part of the Ottoman Empire. And many went back to Palestine, which of course was part of the Ottoman Empire. So that's what I mean by the Middle East. What's very interesting too is that some of the first Jewish communities in the Americas, because a lot of Portuguese and Spanish Jews would eventually settle, somewhere else in Europe or North Africa, and then also traveled and went to the Americas. So the very first Jewish community in Brazil is noted to be a Portuguese Jewish community that settled in Brazil in 1636. And then again, a Sephardic community came to New Amsterdam, which you might know as New York City, in 1654. So these are some of the earliest North American Jewish communities. And they were not Ashkenazi, they were Sephardic. They only were Ashkenazi because of the refugees that came to escape the pogroms, mainly in the late 19th century from Russia, Poland, Belarus, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Moldova, and so on. So it's very, very interesting. And again, three-quarters of my heritage, of my Jewish heritage, is this. So even though I might look different, never judge a book by its cover. Now, the last group I think is really an amazing group of people who really don't get talked about very often. So if you don't know who these people are, if this is the first time you've heard this term, Mizrahi Jews, do not worry about it. No guilt here, no nothing. This is the whole point. We're trying to learn. But who are the Mizrahi Jews? The Mizrahi Jews come from the word Mizrahi, which stems from the Hebrew word for either Eastern or Oriental. Of course, Oriental is not really a politically correct word that we use much anymore. But at the time, of course, the Orient changed. And the Orient used to be like the Middle East and Central Asia and so forth. So we should really, really note that the Mizrahi Jewish community, they never settled in Europe at all. These were not the same group of people who left to the Holy Roman Empire or left to Iberia. They would have stayed in the Middle East or previous to the Muslim conquest and the Crusades. They would have been in places like Alexandria, Damascus, even in the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen, Babylon, so Iraq, also in Iran. In Central Asia, there was a community in Afghanistan. In fact, just until the Taliban recently took over Afghanistan or retook over Afghanistan, there was one Jewish person, one Jewish man who was left in Afghanistan. He moved. So now there are none. In Uzbekistan is where we get what Joe talked about. A very interesting amazing group of people called the Bukharian Jews. Fascinating culture. You can Google them. They do not look like me. They do not look like what we think, Jewish people or Ashkenazi Jews look like. It's very, very interesting. And they also had very different customs and so forth. Um, there was also a group that migrated from the Middle East to India, especially to Central and South India. There's one that went from the Middle East and got all the way to a place called Kaifeng in China. And of course, places like Azerbaijan and Dagestan and the Caucasus as well. So these were people who mostly after the 7th century and 8th century would end up in Muslim lands. And these are the Mizrahi. Now, today, most Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews that live in Israel are combined into one group. But, and as far as traditions are concerned, the Mizrahi traditions and the Sephardic traditions that are combined are different to the schisms and to the different levels of observance as in the Ashkenazi world. Okay. Before I get on to again, I'm going to have two slides here on languages because everyone knows I love languages. So this is before I get into movements and denominations. One feature of these diaspora movements is that they created what are called Jewish diaspora language. So what is a Jewish diaspora language? I'm pretty sure that many of you may have heard uh, the Yiddish language before, maybe know some of the Yiddish language. Shmir, Bagel, uh, Oy Vesmir, um, uh, tuckus, putz, verklempt. These are Yiddish words. And this became the lingua franca by the 19th century and 20th century, the lingua franca of the Ashkenazi community. There was, and it's also referred to as Judeo German. There was, for example, a Judeo French and a Judeo Czech, but they did not survive. Judeo German, which is Yiddish, is. And of course, Yiddish today is spoken a lot in the United States in the ultra Orthodox communities. And 85% of Yiddish speakers, unfortunately, were murdered during the Holocaust. So it is considered an endangered language. The Sephardic community had other Judeo languages like Judeo Catalan, Judeo Provençal, Judeo Portuguese, but Ladino, which is also called Judeo Spanish, was the one by the 15th century and afterwards that became the lingua franca of the Sephardic Jewish community. In the Mizrahi world, because their communities were spread more and they really didn't experience being expelled until the 40s. The Mizrahis has a plethora of wonderful, amazing, and very interesting Judeo languages. For example, there is a Judeo Arabic. There's a Judeo Georgian, also called Gruznik. There is Judeo Malayalam, which is Malayalam is a cousin language to Tamil. It's called the Dravidian language in southern India. There's a Judeo Marathi in central India. That's an Indo-Aryan language that descends from Sanskrit and is cousins to Hindi and Urdu, Gujarati, and so forth. And then, because we have Joe here, and I know Joe is learning Farsi, I thought she might be interested in the Judeo-Persian varieties. So we do have a Judeo-Persian, which is spoken by the Jewish community in Iran, mostly also spoken in Southern California and New York, where the diaspora of Persian Jewish community left in 1979. There is, of course, Judeo-Tajik. We know that Tajik is a type of Persian language, along with Farsi and Dari. And this is Bukharian. So the Bukharians spoke Judeo-Tajik or the Bukharian language, and they, although they are Tajiks, their cities and their settlements were mostly in Uzbekistan. And then finally, there's a really interesting language called Judeo-Tat, which is a variety of Persian spoken by the Jewish, what we call the mountain Jewish community in the Caucasus, mostly in places like Azerbaijan and in Dagestan, so the North Caucasus and along the Caspians and so forth. Just these very, very fascinating languages, these diaspora languages. And what do they have in common? Okay, what are the features of these languages? Well, number one, all of those languages that I just mentioned, so from German, Spanish, Arabic, Georgian, Malayalam, Marathi, Persian, Tajik, and Tat, as a spoken language, they are similar to the other spoken languages, okay? So, for example, like Yiddish is spoken German. So, if you hear somebody speak Yiddish, it is. Now, it is also German that comes from the High German dialects in like the 9th century. So, it's not the same as standardized, but when you hear it, it's German. The grammar will always differ, okay, but the grammar is more connected to the language. So even though the grammar will differ from Hebrew, let's say, like Hebrew grammar is different, but these languages are structurally similar to the languages, okay? So in this case, as I mentioned, Yiddish is like a spoken German. It's structurally German, meaning in grammar. We take Ladino. Ladino sounds like a Spanish language, which it is, Castilian Spanish, mainly from the 15th century. And its grammar is the same. And it's the same with the Arabic and the Georgian and the Malayalam. So they're both spoken and they both are structurally those languages. But the Judeo part comes in under two different features. The first feature is that there is a lot of Hebrew influence in their words, including whatever nation or territory that they're in. So in Yiddish and in Ladino and Judeo-Arabic and so forth, there are a lot of Hebrew words, Hebrew loan words. But in the Yiddish that was spoken in like Lithuania, there was a lot of Lithuanian words. In the Ladino that is spoken and is spoken because there is a community of about 20,000 Ladino speakers in Istanbul, well, they'll have a lot of Turkish loan words and so forth. The community, when I went to Skopje last year, and I mentioned that I saw went to a Jewish museum, and there was this presentation exhibition on the Ladino language, and they had a lot of South Slavic, Macedonian, Slavic, Bulgarian words. Okay, so the loan words are still the majority are German or whatever in Yiddish's case, but there's lots of borrowings. But the one thing that these all these languages have in common, and there's also other languages, um, for example, so even though they might be Indo-European languages, Kartvelian language, Dravidian language, and of course, and Afro-Asiatic languages. Doesn't matter. They all use the Hebrew characters, so the Hebrew written alphabet, and that is 100% across the board. So spoken and grammatical languages will be different depending on what language we're talking about, and the loan words will be from Hebrew and the area which they are in, but they're always written every time with Hebrew characters. And Joe just says here, I find I can understand 60 to 80% of spoken Yiddish, but not written. Yeah, since I don't know the Hebrew alphabet, I'd love to try and see how much Judeo-Persian and Judeo-Tajik I'm to understand. Yeah, do that and let us know because I'm sure there'd be some, for sure. Maybe Judeo-Persian a little more because the Bukharians, I mean, they've been living fairly abroad. Some still in Uzbekistan, but, like, not a lot since the Russians took over, and that was, I think, the middle of the 19th century. But I would be very interested, and especially, yeah, if you know German, you could probably understand. Yeah, Yiddish sounds like weird German to me, just like Plattdeutsch and Dutch. Exactly. Exactly, yeah. And German speakers love Yiddish. They find it again to be to very very funny. I'm late. Blame Pete Panzerotti. Hey, listen, if it floats your boat, Pete, go ahead. Okay, now this time is for my final slides on the movements or the denominations. Excuse me, on the Jewish movements or the denominations, and I want to make uh, one thing that's very clear, very interesting, which is these movements, which stem from rabbinical Judaism, only happened in the Ashkenazi world. So most of these denominations, movements started in the United States. And so, because the US is majority Ashkenazi, it means that the Sephardic and the Mizrahi are normally what we might call either traditional or, in some cases, Orthodox. And this is where I'm going to start with that. So, before the schisms, which really began in the 19th century, most Jewish people who lived in a village, like a small village, would go to one synagogue. They had one rabbi, and they performed what we might refer to today as just traditional Judaism. There were no schisms, there was no different theology or philosophy. They all just went there. In bigger cities, Budapest, Vienna, Berlin, Venice, etc., there would be, of course, more than one, and you would go to the one in your district or the one closest to your neighborhood, but everyone would go. There was no theological or schism kind of division within that. This would, of course, change in the 19th century. So the first thing is what are the three major Jewish denominations? And when I mean major, I just mean they have the most people. And is considered to be Reform Judaism, also sometimes called Progressive Judaism, Conservative Judaism, also known as Masorti Judaism, and then Orthodox Judaism. The first one we're going to talk about is the Reformed Jewish community. During the 19th century, nationalism and liberalism, and especially what we call the Jewish Enlightenment, those ideas were starting to take hold. In the previous century, I want to say 17th century, 18th century, there was a thinker named Moses Mendelssohn who asked a question, which was, could someone who's Jewish be first a member of their nation and then second they be Jewish? So what was kind of more important? This had to do with assimilation and things like this and integration. Moses Mendelssohn answered the question. He said no, it was more important to be Jewish, and he continued to be very traditional. But in the 19th century, there was a group of people in Germany, as there was a German Revolution and nationalist revolution in that year of 1848 that I did mention last time with revolution and Karl Marx. And as I said, I will make a PowerPoint on that because it's very fascinating. But they were also starting to talk about liberalism. And one of the things about liberalism in the Enlightenment was a separation between someone's personal life and someone's private life and someone's public life. So that was the idea was, do we integrate? Can we be German and Jewish? Can our loyalties to German and being a German citizen, is that more important than being Jewish, etc.? So this is where Reform Judaism takes place in 19th century Germany. It also takes hold in the United States in the late 1800s. And it basically answers the question that we should integrate and modernize our traditions. The idea of Reform Judaism is when it comes to things like the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, or the first 5 books that are in the Christian Old Testament or the Jewish Hebrew Bible, are considered to be revelations. So, in Reform Judaism, the typical outlook, and again, individually this may change, the typical outlook is that the Torah was ultimately written by human beings and it is ultimately imperfect in its translation. This is when we get into things like being non literal, mostly allegorical, and applying what is called biblical criticism. Because of this, Jewish law, so things like dietary restrictions and using conveniences on the Sabbath, are not considered obligatory, and the traditions can change and adapt to modernity. So in Reform Judaism, uh, being kosher, eating kosher is considered optional. You don't have to if you don't want to, or you might if you do. It's up to each individual. Not only can you drive to the synagogue, which is something that traditional communities don't do, especially on the Sabbath, but you can work on the Sabbath, and that's up to you. Because these are modern conveniences. If they take you to the synagogue, great. If you can't show up, okay. It's up to you. They also became very interested in egalitarian rights, meaning that women and men could do the same thing. They also are very strong in social justice, anti poverty measures, and of course, accepting the LGBTQ community. And most Jewish communities in the English speaking world, specifically in the US, Canada, and other places like this, and especially the US and Canada, I should say, are reform. So, this is why reform, in many cases, has a very similar observance track record of most Christians. Maybe you'll go to synagogue on Friday evening, but you probably just go for the high holidays. Maybe you don't, maybe you still eat pork or whatever, but you're Jewish, but it's a very like adaptable type of denomination. Okay. Well, ultimately, every action leads to an equal to opposite reaction, as Newton says, and it's true in politics and religion, I think, anyway. So, what is Orthodox Judaism? Well, Orthodox Judaism, a lot of people think that it's like the original Jews, like when I mentioned those traditional Jewish communities, and to some extent, if you lived in like Galicia or Poland or Ukraine, there were men that wore long black suits and they had certain hairstyles and so forth. And those things began before the modern era. So there was definitely some overlap. But the establishment of Orthodox Judaism, let's call it the Counter Reformation, if we're going to be more Christian like, I guess, are the people who started this reaction. They said, "There's no way, right? That's not true. We're not going to adapt to modernity." They kind of see modernity not always as a bad thing, but when it comes to tradition, they're much more literalistic. And so, when it comes to their interpretation of Scripture, let's call it that, or the Torah, they believe, like it says, that it was literally given to Moses at Mount Sinai. They believe in the Orthodox Jewish community tend to believe that Jewish law is obligatory and they cannot change. So not only if you eat kosher, but everything you have to eat is kosher certified. So for example, it's not just you don't eat pork or you don't eat, shellfish. It's if you eat chicken or beef, it must be kosher. If you eat cheese, it must not have any what's called retinin, I think is the ingredient that could have a non-kosher animal byproduct. Gelatin is sometimes made with pig skins, so you don't eat anything like that. They're very, very strict, and that never changes, okay? And then also, they will get up usually, very devout people will get up before sun up, and they will have what's called a tefillin, which is sort of a leather strap that they tie around either their left or right arm with a little box that has a piece of Torah, and they pray and they do all the prayers and they do that 3 times a day, and it's very traditional because again, it's not changing. That's the whole idea. Now, there's two main branches of the Orthodox movement: modern Orthodox and the ultra Orthodox. The difference being that in the modern movement, most modern Orthodox men and women will just dress like everyone else, buy clothes from, Old Navy or H&M or whatever. And so they will look like, you know, clothing wise. Men will wear the kippah outside continuously. Of course, you don't sleep with the kippah, you don't shower with the kippah, but generally, once they put it on in the morning, which is when they pray, and they'll keep it on even outside, but they still observe the Sabbath, which means they don't drive, they don't do anything that's considered work. So you're not allowed to turn on a light, you're not allowed to light a fire, open an umbrella, or make a payment or anything. So they still do all of those observances. And then there's the ultra Orthodox, which again, I think when most people think of the Jewish community, they think of very specific Ashkenazi ultra Orthodox Hasidic Jews, or what are called Haredi Jews, who wear black suits, may have big hats, might have what they call the payout, which is a curl. They may wear cloth with tassels around their waist. Like this tends to be what you might think in parts of Brooklyn, and so on, and also even in Jerusalem. And again, it's what I like to say. It's like in the Jewish world, it would be like me thinking that all Christians were Amish, because there are people who will say, "Mark, you don't look Jewish," and they mean because I'm not um, ultra Orthodox. And again, that would be like me saying to my Christian friends, "Well, you don't look Christian, you're not Amish." Again, this is one piece, but there's a whole pie out there. And generally speaking, the ultra Orthodox dress and live differently from modern secular society. And depending on the community, there can also be self-voluntary communal isolation from what they call the or der jüdische Welt, which is Yiddish means the Jewish world, and der Goyim Welt, which means the world of the Gentiles. And this is where we get a lot of like fundamentalist type of dogma communities and so forth. So that is Orthodox. The next one is called conservative or Masorti Judaism. And this begins in the very early 20th century, I believe sometime around 1902 to 1905. Uh, That's right. A Gentile or a goyim is someone who is not Jewish. That's right, Joe. It begins its life in the Jewish Theological Seminary, very famous seminary and rabbinical school in New York City. And conservative Judaism was started there because the rabbis believed that the reform was just too modern and too liberal, and that they were missing the point of Judaism, whereas the Orthodox were too dogmatic and too, conservative. And so conservative Judaism, ironically called conservative, doesn't mean politically conservative, because as I've mentioned before, reform means liberal, conservative means moderate, and orthodox means conservative in our religion of Judaism. But they felt that they were just way too traditional and dogmatic, so they created conservative Judaism as a midway point. So the main thought on Jewish law is that it's obligatory, but traditions can change. So this is a this is me attempting to get a free meal out of my non-Jewish friends who are watching this. I want to let you know something. This is the full disclosure, the denomination that I belong to. If you invite me over to your home and you cook me as a non-Jew and you cook me a vegetarian meal or you order like a vegetarian pizza, technically the cheese, for example, may not be kosher. Okay. Maybe, right? Now, I'm not gonna eat pork, and, because I can't eat pork anyway. I'm not gonna eat beef unless it's koshered, etcetera, and I don't really even eat meat. But if you have me over and you order from your favorite pizza place a vegetarian pizza, even though there might be a chance that the cheese is not kosher, the rule, and this is why I'm emphasizing the law is obligatory, but the tradition can change. The actual rules in conservative Judaism say, I must partake because I have to live in the world. So if you were to do that with a friend who was Orthodox, either they would have to bring their own food to your house because they cooked it in their own kosher kitchen, or they wouldn't be able to eat with you, which means they can't integrate and they can't really go to your dinner party. But if you have me over, we have a vegetarian pizza, I will eat it because as someone who's non-Jewish, you are giving me food and I've got to live in the world. So it's okay to ignore or even to put aside some of those strong ideas. I'm still kosher because I'm still not eating pork. I'm still kosher because I'm still not eating seafood. And I'm still kosher because I'm not going to eat beef or chicken or goose or whatever that isn't koshered. But you're doing your best. You're my friend, and so on. And yes, if you invite me over for a free meal, I will. I will partake as long as it's vegetarian. That is our rule in conservative. Now it also says that as far as the Torah is concerned, again, it's in the middle here. It says that the people who wrote the Torah, which they believe would be many authors, maybe Moses, but maybe many others, were divinely inspired by their faith and their Jewishness and their belief in God. So it wasn't literal, it wasn't um, non-literal, it was just inspired. And as I mentioned here, kosher is obligatory, but the rules, as I said, I can accept food from non-Jewish people as long as it's vegetarian. If I want to do something that is considered work, using electronics or even driving to the synagogue, I can do that on the Sabbath, so long as it's done in a way where I'm doing something Jewish. So if I click on a light, it's okay on the Sabbath as long as I'm reading something Jewish or doing something Jewish or whatever. And so that's the rules that I also keep with. And we're also egalitarian because men and women have equal rights. After this, we're going to get into the last three slides. And these are what are the three minor Jewish movements. I use the word minor only because of population size. I do want to say all of these movements were also found in the US and only occur in the Ashkenazi world. But these are very interesting and I wanted to showcase some of them here. The first one, the oldest of the minor movement, is called Reconstructionist Judaism, and this was founded in the 1920s by a gentleman named Mordecai Kaplan. He was once a conservative Jewish rabbi and studied at the aforementioned Jewish Theological Seminary, but he started having doubts, and especially about certain interpretations of Judaism and some theology. So he and started to believe, and this is a tenet of the Reconstructionist religion, which is that Judaism is an evolving religious civilization. They also made the statement that the Jewish people are not the chosen people. They were the first group to take some of our Hebrew prayers, and many times, of course, it talks in the prayer books where God is identified as a man with words like he and him and his and king. Well, Rabbi Kaplan took a lot of that language and made it gender neutral. So they don't refer to God as he or him or king or anything like this. And Rabbi Kaplan, I believe, if he didn't coin these two terms, he definitely used them very much in theological, was he believed in what was called transtheism, which he described, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, to be very close to something like pantheism, where God was not considered a personal being, but more of an omnipresence and so forth. And then he also talked about transnaturalism because he didn't believe that the world was just natural, that there wasn't anything spiritual, but he didn't believe in the supernatural either. He believed in the middle, which is that there was something transcendent of God. Some God was a transcendence, and that also God was transcendent of nature. And so some people called him an atheist for this or trying to hide his atheism, but a lot of pantheists get that blame by hardline atheists. However, there are many different Reconstructionist movements throughout Canada, the United States, mostly Canada and the United States, and in the U.S. Seemed at one time as an alternative to conservative Judaism and so on. The next one is one of the most interesting, I think. These last two, especially, and again, also Reconstructionist, but it's a very, very interesting, denomination movement that's called Humanistic Judaism. So, Humanistic Judaism was founded in the United States in the 1960s by a gentleman named Rabbi Sherman Wein, and he was an active Reform rabbi in the Detroit, Michigan era and had a congregation. And he started to notice that many in his congregation were either atheists, agnostics, they didn't believe in God, they weren't terribly religious, they didn't really have much of a connection to the spiritual aspects of Reform Judaism or Judaism in general. And so he started what was called the Society for Humanistic or of Humanistic Judaism, and almost like what Rabbi Kaplan did in the previous slide, is Rabbi Wein removed the references to God and like revelations and so forth, and added language that was more what we would call secular or humanistic. So he makes references to things like humanity, the light of humanity, and so forth, which was also very common in the secular humanist movement that was starting around the same time. And they do have services, Shabbat services, holiday services like Hanukkah, Rosh Hashanah, which is coming up, etc. But they've removed the God language, so they're called non-theistic. And many people who sort of like they may or may not believe in God necessarily, right? But it's considered non-theistic, so there's no espoused belief in God. So many people who might be considered more secular Jewish or culturally Jewish also tend to like this particular denomination because it doesn't invoke any kind of spiritual or religious. It's mostly cultural and non-theistic. And so, yeah, and so that one's also, again, mostly popular in the United States. There's some communities in Israel, but also in Canada. And finally, we have the newest of all, or the most recent of all these minor movements. which is called Renewal Judaism. And Renewal Judaism began around the countercultural movement in the 1960s and 1970s America. So that means, of course, beatniks, hippies, and so forth. Its founder was a gentleman named Rabbi Zalman Sacher Shalomi, who was born into the Hasidic Orthodox movement. And it says it here that it attempts to reinvigorate Judaism with mysticism, music, and meditation. In some ways, it is considered very traditional, and in other ways, very non traditional. And they emphasize things like egalitarianism, environmentalism, pacifism, and gender equality. For us who are not, and I don't know, I've never been to a community of renewal Jews, but most people like myself tend to think of them as the hippie Jews. And I do get a picture of these individuals in a park somewhere, sitting on a picnic blanket, with acoustic guitars, that are sort of singing folk songs. They've sort of, I guess, rearranged the Hebrew prayers as sort of 60s folk songs, and they're the sort of the peace loving. They do like Buddhist meditation, and yeah, I don't know these communities firsthand experience, but one day maybe I'll be lucky enough to find myself in a city that has a renewal Jewish movement, and look them up and find and find a service. But really, that's what they are kind of in some ways, sarcastically known as are the hippie Jews. So I want to thank everyone because that is the last slide that I have. Before, of course, I leave here tonight, I want to mention that tomorrow, at the same time that I started this stream at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, I am going live with From a Poet, Brian Lucas, and we are going to talk about ancient history. And we're going to talk about some things probably to do with Jews and other things. And From a Poet, Brian is very much interested in ancient history, so we're going to discuss some of those things. One moment. So please, if you can join us for that one. That goes live at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, which is, of course, 8 p.m. in the UK, 9 p.m. my time, or 12 noon if you are on the Pacific Coast in the US and Canada. And so we are going to do ancient history. And of course, like always, I would like you to visit my community tab where I am going to do a poll on what I'm going to talk about next Wednesday. I'll have two topics for you to choose from. They will be topics that were rejected in previous polls. And then next Saturday, I will continue with the PowerPoint and I will let you guys know during the week which one that is because I have a few of them and I don't know exactly which one I want to do, but it will probably have to do with the history topic like usual. So, in conclusion to all of this, this was my longest, PowerPoint so far, my longest live at over an hour and a half. So I really, really want to thank everyone who's here, all of our friends, Peter, Irish, Clearwater, Chad, Joe, Black Boots. If I'm missing anybody, I apologize. But thank you everyone who showed up here, who's listening, who's watching on the replay. Please like my video. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. If you want to share the video, go ahead. And again, thank you very, very much. The information I gave you today is stuff that is very common in the Jewish world, but it's very less common, especially in the academic world. And of course, no judgment here, but to the world of, the Christian and Muslim world. And that's okay because this information has been around for a long time, but it isn't common sense, and that's okay. As I mentioned, you know, when I said I wasn't going to talk about early Christians, only because that takes us to another whole plethora of history that has to do with Christianity that I can't speak on. Doesn't matter that I'm Jewish, but I just don't know much about. But I really want to know more about. So I'm going to try to do my best. Same with Islam, same with other religions. I might know a lot, but I don't know everything. So I do hope that everyone found this very helpful. And just knowing that there are a lots of unfortunate, not only anti-Semitic, but also Islamophobic, acts and hate crimes that are going on all over the world. It's bad. I don't condone any of that. And so, if anyone out there has any kind of issue with what I said today or finds fault in a fact or whatever, just please, as I always say, be civil. Let's talk like adults and so on. So, if you want to engage after the fact through messaging, just do so on good faith so we can have a good talk. And so, finally, I hope this was informative. I hope you learned a lot. I hope that if you have any questions, please use the comments. Let me know if you have anything else. And in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.